transforming fear into power. Webster describes fear as an unpleasant emotion caused by the belief that someone or something is dangerous, likely to cause pain or a threat. But fear is an essential part of our nature. It's there to get our attention because it serves as an alarm system, pushing us in one direction or another out of harm's way. Since humans are wired to sense danger, that means every one of us has had an individual relationship to fear based on some personal experience. Psychologist Thomas Rutledge informs in the book, Embracing Fear, that fear is not pathological, but it's an ingenious guidance system to help ensure our survival. It's part of our intelligence. Therefore, it's likely that for many of us, some form of fear is present on a regular basis, but the form that it chooses to present itself in constantly changes. Just as our dislikes for certain foods or even people from various racial or cultural groups, sometimes our fears stem from beliefs that were impressed upon us during our youth by our parents, grandparents, and the generations that preceded them. This is when we find ourselves unconsciously perpetuating cycles of the previous generations, such as fear of not having enough, not showing affection, and patterns of secrecy around physical or sexual abuse. Some fears are not only generational, but are culturally specific, responsible for increasing marginalization and the widening socioeconomic gap within some groups. However, the intersectionality of culture-directed fear can only be understood by looking at the history of that specific culture, particularly around bias and racism. African Americans entered this country on ships in shackles, and after hundreds of years of enslavement, eras of segregation and Jim Crow, the ideology of the dangerous black male is continually used as a sales pitch to promote fear and convince the American public that certain policies such as the war on drugs and stop and frisk are necessary. However, like the two-way transmission in verbal communication, cultural fear is also two-way. The long history of social and racial inequities directed towards Black people has resulted in fear and mistrust directed towards white people, particularly those in some form of authority. The medical field has a long history of mistreating African Americans from colonial times to the present. Some of the medical experiments are well documented, like the Tuskegee experiment, with study of untreated syphilis in Black men, or the life of Henrietta Lack, whose story was recently told in an HBO movie. She was treated unsuccessfully for cervical cancer in 1951. Cells from the tissue of her tumor provided a breakthrough that proved invaluable to medical research. But her family was kept in the dark, even as they themselves became the subject of scientific interest. COVID-19 is reportedly the worst pandemic in 100 years. Imagine the conflicted feelings of individuals from traditionally marginalized communities both fearing the dreaded virus and fearing the medical community offering a solution. However, the transmission of negative patterns from one generation to the next is not inevitable. It's possible to become the endpoint at which negative family cycles that have thrived for generations are exhausted and can no longer exert their influence. But breaking the pattern is a matter of overcoming those imprinted values and replacing them with conscious awareness. Facing fear is not always easy, but real or imagined, life is always a matter of perspective on what is happening around us. If we allow fear to control us, it will. It's what you do with it that can make all of the difference. When the world, as we have known, feels as if there's no way to find the right answer for what to do, when living in a world that sometimes appears nonsensical and has so many people believing that life on earth feels like an apocalypse, what is really going on is a global crisis of powerlessness. A time when very critical, important, and difficult decisions must be made. In order to overcome fear, we must first recognize it and then foster the courage necessary to defeat it. Because fear can be an opportunity for self-discovery and self-growth. It can be a well of untapped personal power and strength. The gateway from wishing and wanting to doing and being. When trust in federal health agencies continued to wither, a group of Black physicians created a task force to independently vet regulators' decisions about COVID-19, the drugs and the vaccine, as well as government recommendations for curbing the pandemic. This task force was organized by the NMA, National Medical Association, which was founded in 1895 as an answer to racist professional societies that excluded Black doctors. Leon McDougall, family physician and president of the NMA, informs that there's concern that some decisions made by the FDA have been unduly influenced by politicians. The committee is meant to safeguard against any unscientific guidance from the Center for Disease Control and Prevention and also the Food and Drug Administration. However, the organization did eventually endorse both Pfizer and Moderna vaccines. We are continually being bombarded by various natural disasters, and now a variant of the COVID virus. Moreover, there are always some negatives that accompany positives in life. But it seems as if the negatives have outweighed the positives in the past several years. Worst of all, it feels as if there's nothing that can be done about it. But in times of crisis, people somehow find the strength to dig deeper and suspend the superficial reasons to fear one another and find themselves left only with the vulnerability of being human. Organizations across every sector committed to take action for racial equity and social justice as the pandemic widened the racial wealth gap and highlighted racial health disparities. New Orleans has faced devastating disaster after disaster. First, Hurricane Katrina, the coronavirus, and most recently, Hurricane Ida. But through these devastations, all communities crossed socioeconomic and racial boundaries to come together. After the killing of George Floyd, we watched thousands of Americans cross all racial, ethnic lines in the name of activism. Different communities came together to answer the call to justice, even at the risk of their own safety. In the book, Freedom from Fear, Forrest Church breaks down a lifetime of wisdom gleaned from helping others during his ministry into a plan of action for all of us who live in fear. He tells us that fear prevents us from living life to its fullest. And now, more than ever before, we watch fear's grip as it seems to be tightening. Church breaks fear down into 5 basic types that are respectively associated with body, intellect, conscious, emotions, and the soul. First is fright, which is instinctive because it's designed to protect us from danger. Then comes worry, which is produced by our own worst imaginings, which comes from failure to live in the present. Then comes guilt, which is caused by a troubled conscience. This is followed by insecurity, prompted by feelings of inadequacy. Fifth, and finally, we experience dread, which is generated by life's fundamental uncertainty. Most of us suffer from all of these fears at various points and to varying degrees. There's no remedy for physical fear because it's a survival mechanism. But church argues, and I agree, that some other fears are distortions that we allow to take over our lives. I'm in no way minimizing fear of being unable to stave off homelessness or food insecurity, because in the last 18 months, any number of people who feared not having enough to simply just being able to get by, even though they worked hard and steadily as hourly employees, found themselves furloughed and needing to find a different way to provide for themselves and their families. What did they do? They pushed through their fears, tapped into creative expressions, turning old hobbies into new businesses. Lifelong restaurant and hotel industry workers, determining their own self-worth, boasted market pressures causing business owners to do what is long overdue: pay employees a living wage. During this turbulent time, people began better self-care, offering a reminder to all of us to be gentle with ourselves. When sales dropped in some beauty categories, self-care related items like skin care and bath products increased as consumers looked to bring the salon experience home. This forced many beauty businesses around the world in a move to online sales. While COVID-19 has been the uppermost health fear on most of our minds, I think we've allowed that to overshadow all other life-threatening illnesses. We still coexist with heart disease, diabetes, all forms of cancer in adults and in children. But rather than being polarized into inaction by fear, we face them head on. We do research to find specialists, seek out a second and sometimes even a third opinion, and at other times, take the alternative route for treatments. Right here in this congregation, I know that many of you have leaned into fear and allowed your personal power to take control while moving through some serious illness. Courage is when fear speaks and the heart answers. After absorbing fear's best argument, the heart says no. As Church explains, nothing out of the ordinary is required. Anyone and at almost any time can find the courage to answer fear. The wisdom that makes courage possible is so universal and elemental that it can be summed up in 3 short imperatives. Do what you can, want what you have, and be who you are. From my heart to yours, may it be so.